She put a pot on she hair and gone. Them a the first one out on the dam. Basket on she head, bucket in each hand. Hold up on she frack, I wanna she grandson. To the market, them a go. For the morning, the day is dawning. For Cockacrow to give the villagers a warning. Rise and shine, the birds them a sing. All animal take turn as them join in the waking. Cockacrow, dagaba, donkey bray, horse and they even duck a quack. Cockacrow, dagaba, donkey bray, horse and they even duck a quack. Come and hear this sweet story that tell the people about life in the country. Oh, they are back now.
All right. Hey, guess what? Good night, everybody. Welcome to Anansi Web Education. With me is no stranger. President David Arthur Granger is with us. And tonight we will be talking about you might be wondering, this photograph, that's the Abrams family. The Abrams family, and many of you recall scores of innocent persons were killed during the People's Progressive Party's terrorist campaign, especially during the hurricane of protest of 1964, known as the disturbances. Wednesday, the 12th of June, 2024, marks the 60th anniversary of the massacre of the Abram family during the deadly disturbances. So that photograph that you saw there is the family, the Abrams family. We will be talking about that and more right here on Anansi Web Education. Good night to you, Honorable David Arthur Granger. How are you, sir?
Good night. Thank you for asking. I'm feeling good, and it's always an educational experience to be on Anansi Web Education and to discuss with your viewers and listeners important events. It's not a history program. This is a program about present day Guyana and the future. So it's always a pleasure, and I can almost say it's a duty to be on this program. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Even as we speak, Venezuela is once again trying a thing. I already say that they claim all of Guyana, all of Essequibo. It's a strange land indeed. But outside of that, I hope all is well with you and especially your kitchen garden. I have an eye on your kitchen garden for some reason or the other.
Yeah. When you come to say you get some cabbage, okras, tomatoes, and pak choy.
Yeah, well, people are sending things from Guyana to the U.S. now. Don't wait until you could pack a nice little barrel, a nice little something, and send a kitchen garden. That is. It's good to see you, President Granger, as we prepare to get straight into the discussion today that deals with the hurricane of protest that is known as the disturbances, PPP terrorism, acts of terrorism by the PPP. This takes me to my first question. What was the role of the United Force Party? That's the UF, probably not existing these days, but what was the role of the United Force Party in the disturbances in 1964? Sir?
It's a good question for you to ask, and the comment you made about it is not this, not in existence anymore. When it came on the scene in 1960, it actually was launched in 5th of October 1960. It made history. It was a third party, coming between the PNC and the PPP. But on its first outing in general elections, it was able to garner 16% of the votes. No third party, in my memory, has ever gotten so many votes in the first outing. That is since what we call, the voting under the universal adult franchise. And it was significant. One, because the United Post was able to put together a very important um, part of the constituency. One, it was backed by a lot of businessmen. Two, it was backed by a lot of Christians. And this was at the height of the Cold War. And it was bringing bundles of propaganda in the country, Christian anti-communist crusade. And the majority of Guyanese are Christians. And they were opposed to what is called godless communism. And United Post garnered a lot of support from the hinterland. In those days, the coastal political parties did not pay much attention to the hinterland. And in fact, in the first elections, one of the United Post always made sure they were Amerindian MPs. Well, those days it was called the Legislative Assembly, MLA, members of the Legislative Assembly. One of them was Melville, who was involved in the rebellion in 1969. So the United Force was backed by a dynamic business community, Christian community, ethnic community, and it had the support of the BGTUC. Many people looking at the TUC nowadays wouldn't recognize or wouldn't realize that the president of the TUC in 1961 and 62 was a person who closely allied to the United Post, and he wasn't Portuguese. So the role that he played as leader of the Manpower Citizen Association, which at that time was the most powerful union in the sugar industry, and he was the president of the BGTUC. So when you put all this together, you can see that the United Force was pivotal. Now, of course, it was taken over by the PPP. In fact, the present speaker of the National Assembly was once the leader of the United Force, and the present leader of the United Force is actually the daughter of the speaker um, of the National Assembly. So you can start connecting the dots there. But I would say that the role of the United Force is often underestimated, but it brought a new energy into the political relations in Guyana, onto the political landscape, bringing a lot of Christians, Amerindians, businessmen, people opposed to communism, uh, became very articulate. And the United Post had a powerful paper called the Daily Chronicle, which at that time was owned by the leader of the United Force and managed by a relative of the leader of the United Force. And it also had a clandestine radio station. And it, of course, it wasn't licensed or registered. And they were able to put out propaganda on a daily basis, and very hot and hostile propaganda too. So it was really a thorn in the side. Well, I think there can be other descriptions. A thorn in the side of the PPP, and I would say its role. I don't want to use words like constructive or destructive, but the leader of the United Force he said the mission is to oppose, expose, and depose the government. I think other people have tried to use that expression, but I think it's attributed to Mr. Peter de Geer. His purpose in life was to oppose, expose, and depose the PPP. So he was not faking. He was not, shy of attacking the PPP, and the PPP was not accustomed to that. The PPP, I think, most times he was not prepared to talk in friendly terms to the PPP. The PPP was not prepared to talk in friendly terms to him, and they were enemies. They were not rivals, enemies, I would say. And the role of the United Force was was critical, and many people like to pass the disturbances in ethnic terms, like to paint it in ethnic colors, as if it was African and Indian, but actually it was deeper than that. It was deeper than skin color, and it was deeply ideological, and it was a fierce rivalry between the the PPP and the United Force, more than between the PPP and the PNC. Um, when you walk down Water Street in 19, in the mid 1960s, you were going to shop at Rodriguez, at Finance, at Betancourt, the Careys, Duarte, Mendonca's, JP Santos. These were the big commercial enterprises. And there was no other ethnic group which had a strong commercial footprint in Guyana in the mid 1960s, like the Portuguese. And I say this not from an ethnic point of view, but from the point of view of a corporate community. And this is what the PPP came face to face with. No organization had a similar uh, PR machine, with radio. Those days there was no television, but certainly there were radio and newspaper. And it used, Mr. The guy used his newspaper to attack the PPP relentlessly, to expose, depose, and expose the PPP, expose, depose, and oppose the PPP day after day. And when you see the report, the British government report on the 1962 crisis, there's a whole section of headline news from the Daily Chronicle. It was serious.
Serious indeed. I guess that's where, after the correlation between the PNC and the UF, that's where we now have the Guyana Chronicle, came from the UF.
Well, it was nationalized. It was nationalized. It became state property after the decline of the coalition broke up in 1968, because some members of the United Force saw that the activities of the leader of the United were conflictual and confrontational. They were not helping to develop Guyana. Many of them left and joined the PNC. And after that, some of the enterprises collapsed, and many of the Portuguese businessmen migrated. The terror of seeing what happened to the Abraham family, just people just couldn't stay in a country like that, and businesses were closed, and the whole character of the central business district, the whole character of Guyanese enterprise changed after the mid 60s. And this wasn't the doing of the PNC, this was the doing of the PPP. The terrorism of 1964 really drove a lot of people out of this country. That's the truth.
Indeed, terrorism, acts of terrorism by the PPP. We've seen signs, lots and lots of signs these days, 2024, Leninism, bullyism, you name it. It takes me now to our second question. Why was the Abram family targeted for the deadly terrorist attack? And let me just show folks the Abram family. This family was actually targeted. They were targeted for the deadly terrorist attack under the PPP, or said to be by the PPP regime, directly by the PPP regime. Why, Mr. Granger?
There are several factors which help to explain why this particular family became the target. First, the United Force, established in 1960, established something called the Guyana United Youth Society, in 1961, July 1961, a few months after the party came into existence. It was very strong, very vibrant. The GUYS, the PPP had the PYO, and the PNC had the YSM, but the United Force had the GUYS. And they had strong countrywide membership. Now, Miss Anne Abraham was an executive member of the GUYS. She was a young bank clerk working at the Barclays Bank DCO. It was then called DCO, which meant Dominions, Colonies, and Overseas. It was the main imperial bank in Guyana. The site is what is now GBTI in Water Street. So she was a clerk at that bank. So A, you had the GUIS. B, she was a member of the GUIS and she worked at a bank. Third, the PPP always denied its connection to the USSR, at least its reliance on financial support from the USSR. The USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. This was a huge, if you want to call it, empire. In those days, during the Cold War, you had the USA and the Western Allies, and they had the USSR and the Eastern Allies. And the PPP was getting help from the USSR, and it denied it was getting financial help from the USSR. But they backed the money. Of course, those days we were a colony, and there was no direct financial contact between the USSR and British Guyana. The money had to pass through London, the Barclays Bank DCO. And the officials in the Barclays Bank, obviously, they saw the money transfer documents. So in 1963, soon after the general strike, Miss Abraham was charged with seditious libel for stating that, and this statement came through the Daily Chronicle newspaper, alleging that the government of British Guyana was receiving money from the government of the Union of Socialist Republics. So Mrs. Janet Jagan actually convened a press conference attempting to show that this report was false. But the Chronicle published the actual documents showing that the money was in fact being transferred. So although Ms. Abraham was charged and four other officials of the United Force were charged with seditious libel, the DPP had to withdraw the charges, what the lawyers call null pros. The DPP had to withdraw prosecution because you can't prosecute somebody for being libel, for committing libel, when in fact it was not libel. Libel, the truth can't be libelous. And so this is what was happening. And now we had the father of Miss Anne Abraham, he was a public servant, a permanent secretary in the office of the premier, which is the highest ranking permanent secretary in British Guyana. It is equivalent to what in PPP times later on was the head of the presidential secretariat. He was demoted from the office of the president and sent to be permanent secretary in the Ministry of Works and Hydraulics, or the Ministry of Public Works. And there's nothing to indicate that Mr. Abraham was corrupt or that he was politically aligned. It is generally accepted that he was a straight, objective, principled, professional public servant. And he was suddenly removed. So here we had a situation in which his daughter is charged for seditious libel. He is removed from his position in the office of the premier. And the DPP enters a null pros. So you can see there's more in the mortar than the pestle. Now, Mrs. Janet Jagan, who was General Secretary of the PPP at that time, was Minister of Home Affairs. But at the beginning of April, Um, I think she resigned. Sorry, the beginning of June she resigned. The beginning of June she resigned as Minister of Home Affairs, which meant that she was no longer responsible for Home Affairs, no longer responsible for human safety, no longer responsible for public security. And uh, 10 days after she resigned, the Abraham family house went up in flames, killing Mr. Abraham and seven members of his family. The only members who were saved were Mrs. Abraham, who I think was waiting for her daughter, um, who was at the theater guild at that time. And the story is that she jumped over the balcony and broke her arm. And another daughter, a very young daughter who was with her, was saved. And the one who was at the theater guild. All of the others were burnt to death. Two bombs were placed while they were sleeping in the Abraham family home, and they were placed in such a way that when the fire spread, the entire house was engulfed in flames, and all the lives of the people in the building at that time were lost. Um, so why was the Abraham family targeted? Why was Mr. Abraham transferred from the office of the premier to the Ministry of Public Works? Why was the daughter charged with seditious libel? Why were the charges against her dismissed by the DPP? Um, why was the Guyana United Youth Society so powerful and influential at that time? All of these factors led to what happened. And of course, the United Force was more than a thorn in the side of the PPP at that time. It had a daily newspaper called the Daily Chronicle. It had a clandestine broadcasting transmitter. It had solid support by the business community, by the Catholic Church, and by other Christians too, and by the indigenous community at that time, many of which had Catholic missions. Many of the Catholic priests operated in the hinterland communities at that time. And all of these factors just came together on the 12th of June, 1964. And the Abraham family was targeted for this deadly terrorist attack.
So sad. Good evening, good night. If you're now joining us, this is Anansi Web Education with the president, former president of the Cooperative Republic of Guyana, David Granger. We're discussing the fact that scores of innocent persons were killed during the People's Progressive Party's terrorist campaign during the hurricane of protest of 1964, known as the disturbances. On the 12th of June 2024, that's this year, it marks the 60th anniversary of the massacre of the Abraham family during the deadly disturbances, compliments, of course, of the PPP and their acts of terrorism. This takes me now to our final question for tonight. What were the consequences of the Abraham family massacre? And so basically, we're considering the changes as we observe today. The pattern remains the same. But talking about that final question, the effect of that massacre against the Abraham family, Mr. Granger.
Uh, I think we need to go back to what people believe and how they think and behave. Many people just brush aside the fact that the PPP claims to be a Leninist party. Uh, Many people try to feel that Leninism is irrelevant. And why should a party maintain its ideology as Leninist 74 years after it's been founded? You know, why didn't they get rid of it if they don't believe in it? If they held on to it because they believe in Leninism. Leninism is not socialism. Leninism is not Marxism. Leninism is not communism. Leninism is terrorism. Leninism believes in seizing revolutionary power by any means and holding on to that power to run the state totally. Russia today is a Leninist state. DPRK today is a Leninist state. My friends, this seems to be very difficult for people to understand. And unless you understand it, you can't understand the PPP mindset. The PPP is not a democratic party, it's a Leninist party. It's not a Marxist party, it's a Leninist party. And it believes in total control. You just go back and listen to what people were saying when they go into these villages, Belgium and Mocha Arcadia and Ithaca, during the local government election. Total control. That's all they're interested in. So when we talk about the consequences, you're talking about the fact that you had and you still have a party which believes in total control. It doesn't believe in power sharing. It doesn't believe in social cohesion. It doesn't believe in even consultation. It just believes that its way is the only way, right or wrong. It's going to be that way. And they will destroy social cohesion. They destroy the Ministry of, you know, of citizenship. They'll destroy, the public service staff college because their way is the way, and they don't want to pay attention to other approaches to dealing with anything. Public security, national development. That is the Leninist way, total control. So what we have here with the Abraham family massacre is the concretization or the solidification of that attitude, that 74-year-old attitude of the PPP. In short term, a short term examination would show that we had a family which was regarded as being a traditional, God fearing Catholic family 50 meters away from the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception. And it triggered the migration of Portuguese and the collapse of Portuguese enterprise in Ghana. That was the first obvious consequence. Secondly, it showed that the PPP was prepared to use any means possible to maintain power. And in 1964, the stakes were that if the orders of the British government were enforced, that is to say, if the PR election system was to be imposed, the PPP would lose its majority. If elections were not held, PPP would lose its majority. Because they wanted to stay in power until the next year after independence. They wanted independence right away under the old electoral system. So the PPP was committed to making Ghana ungovernable. So one of the consequences of the massacre is that the PPP demonstrated how serious they were. That they were able to wipe out a family. Children, mother, father, everybody. Well, not the mothers, the children, the father and the children, in order to get its own way. There's no negotiation. Resistance meant death. The other consequence, of course, is that hundreds of people died. The Abraham family must have been the first family massacre, but after that, you had things like the Son Chapman atrocity. But that was another massacre, and several other massacres took place around the country. So the Baku was out of the bottle, all hell broke loose. And the PPP was receiving weapons from communist country. It was receiving money from communist country. Members of the PYO were being trained in communist countries. Some of the people that they celebrate, like Michael Ford, had been trained in communist country to practice terror and sabotage. So the consequences were that A lot of bloodshed was brought into this country. Weapons were brought in this country. Uh, Money from the USSR was brought in this country to make this so-called revolution. And a lot of innocent Guyanese in the villages throughout the coast were involved. You didn't have to be involved in the sugar industry. You didn't have to be on strike. You know, some people, school children were killed, families were killed. So the consequences are immeasurable. What happened to Guyana during the disturbances and the Abraham family massacre was symbolic. Although many people, for different reasons, maybe for religious reasons, ethnic reasons, don't want to make much about it. There are people living today who knew who was responsible for that massacre. They speak about everything under the sun, but they never speak about the massacre. People whose relatives knew about the money transfer. Up now in big political parties, but they never say this happened. My father, my brother, my mother, my whatever knew what was taking place. There is a conspiracy of silence, and that has affected, um, you know, not only political relations but social relations again. They speak about a death here or death there. They don't speak about the central issue of the decision that was taken to wipe out this family. And that, until they come to terms with it, until they come to terms with that, they won't come to terms with themselves and this theory of Leninism that the PPP still hold on to. And you can see that in every aspect of government, local government, central government, the PPP attitude of Leninism still remains. So, what were the consequences of the Abraham family massacre? Yes, it wiped out the family. It destroyed the Portuguese business community. It made relationships in Guyana, personal, social, political relationships, more hostile than ever before. Um, and this is the type of mentality which we saw again in the troubles. When the PPP returned to office in 1992, it was their way or no way. And unfortunately, I think the legacy of the Abraham family massacre was not explored by people living today who knew who was responsible for it and who knew the thinking behind it. As a result of that, the thinking continues. And Guyana will never overcome the horrors of the past unless it overcomes the horrors of that massacre. It explains a lot about how the PPP operates. And until we deal with that issue, we will always be hostage to that bitter memory.
So sad indeed. The Abrams family act of terrorism on the part of the PPP regime. This is so sad. As we wrap up tonight's program, repeat as to what the subject was all about this evening. Scores of innocent persons were killed during the People's Progressive Party's terrorist campaign during the hurricane of protest of 1964, known as the disturbances. On the 12th, that's June 12th, 2024, marks the 60th anniversary of the massacre of the Abram family during the deadly disturbances, terrorism, compliments of the PPP regime. Mr. Granger, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it as always. And we've just got to keep hope alive for a brighter future for our younger uh, generation, our next generations to come, and for the sake of the survival of Guyana. We need peace. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mark. But let me say, hope is not a strategy. Hope is not a
Thank you.
planning strategy. I agree with you. We should keep hope alive, but we need to do more to
That
remove
just
the
keep hope.
menace of PPP Leninism. Have a good night.
Get you, sir. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And to all of our listeners in and outside of Guyana, God bless you.
Me know I come home in a jackass yard for fetchy load. Cockle giant, bag over shoulder, running by his side, a Rexy and Rover. From the farm, them a come. So now go down, but up the river. Some washing clothes, some folks are bathing at the water. Fisherman, they catch them.